The legal cannabis industry has unlocked generational wealth opportunities across the country. But the industry's regulatory complexities, constant state of change, and speed of evolution drive confusion for entrepreneurs and investors alike. On this podcast, we'll interview the industry leaders who are shaping the future of the legal cannabis industry to help our listeners understand these idiosyncrasies. This is Cannabis Unlocked, hosted by Key Investment Partners. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Cannabis Unlocked. I'm Jordan Youkilis, one of the founding partners of Key Investment Partners, and today I am honored to be joined by Chris Walsh. Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm actually honored to be here as well. So excited to talk about this business.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just so excited to get your perspective as the CEO of MJ Biz Daily. You know, you have seen so much in the industry's transformation, and obviously, just by nature of your business, you're literally always at the forefront of what's the cutting edge, latest information. So would love to get into all of that, but maybe just to kick things off, would love if you could give the listeners a little bit of background on who you are and your career progression.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually from the Denver area, and I went to college out here and majored in journalism. So that was my professional background, and I worked at mainstream newspapers, covering everything from the end of the rise of the tech industry. I graduated in early 2000 and was covering technology companies for a newspaper. And within 6 months, the whole thing had collapsed with the tech bust. So that was a real trial by fire, and learned a lot of lessons about business in general then that we could see play out in cannabis, and that we have seen in Canada play out with a lot of irrational exuberance around a thriving industry. And so I stayed in journalism as a reporter and an editor. I moved to South Korea, and then I was moving back and considering new options. I was earning my MBA in international business, and I left for South Korea in 2009. And when I came back 2 years later, there were more dispensaries, medical marijuana dispensaries in Denver than Starbucks. That was a common phrase that everyone would throw out to show you how quickly that the industry cropped up here in the Colorado area. And when I had left in 2009, there were 0 dispensaries. It wasn't even an industry. So in a 2-year time, it became an actual business. And so 2 women who co-founded this company together hired me to help launch it, and basically to serve a nascent industry that had no access to business intelligence, to news, to analysis, to data. Back then there was none of that. And a lot of people saw medical cannabis industry as a joke. So that's really how this company started and how I transitioned into it. I was in the journalism side and had my MBA, and I was really just intrigued by this opportunity to help build this pioneering company in an industry that we didn't even know if it would be around in a year or 2.
Wow. Well, that's fantastic to hear that you just took the leap in at such an early time. And I would just love to hear, what are some, and I know this is such a big question, but I mean, what are some of the biggest changes you've seen in that time frame from 2011 to today?
I mean, the changes are massive, and the industry evolved in a way that no one could have predicted, and that I certainly didn't predict, being close to it in its kind of early days. But back then it was not very professional. There were not experienced business people, entrepreneurs, investors involved almost at all. There were definitely some, but most had an affinity for cannabis. Maybe had been growing it in college or as adults, maybe used it frequently, and all of a sudden found themselves in an environment where they were going to try and open a business and, not have to do this in the shadows and go over to some dude's house and, purchase marijuana in the basement and smoke some with the person selling it to you, right? This was a whole new thing. And at that time, no one knew how this was going to play out because it was federally illegal, as it is now. But businesses didn't exist. So as states started legalizing, entrepreneurs said, we're going to try this and see what happens. And so there were really no regulations back then in most states that had legalized. So you just had this situation where a state had legalized and cleared the way, and people took risks. And I use the term entrepreneurs loosely because these were not serial entrepreneurs. In many cases, they were not. A lot of people didn't come from a professional business background, and some hadn't held real, legit professional jobs, right? And they were opening dispensaries. They started growing cannabis and providing it to caregivers, or they became caregivers. Were giving it to patients. Were opening up storefronts. And so at that time, there was no regulation. So one of the biggest changes we've seen, and it happened fairly quickly in a period of a couple of years, is states started realizing that this industry was cropping up in their backyards, and there were problems without any regulations. You had sign spinners on popular street corners advertising half-price joints. Doesn't seem very medical, and it seems to not really be in the spirit of the laws that were passed. And so anyone and everyone was getting in, and most people didn't have a medical background, medical cannabis, nope. So, you had states quickly start to regulate the industry. And there was a lot of trial and error, what works, what doesn't, what's over-regulation, what's under-regulation, how do you handle enforcement and oversight? And then so you saw this wave of regulation. And now, of course, every state has regulations. And in many cases, they're very strict on the medical side, and then, of course, recreational. So I would say that's one of the biggest changes that we've seen. And also, I would just like to highlight, there's many, many changes, but two more. One is the more recent trend over the last few years of mainstream professionals, very experienced people in the business world getting involved, either joining cannabis companies or starting their own or investing in them, as you yourself have done, right? Coming from a traditional investing background and then seeing the opportunities here. That has been a big change. And then finally, it's really the public opinion. You've got 90% of the population supports the legalization of medical cannabis, over 90%. And you have in the mid to high 60s support recreational legalization. That happened very, very quickly. And for this drug, this plant to be demonized for so long. So all of that combined to make this a really exciting, extremely challenging industry with opportunities, kind of everywhere you look.
Yeah. And it's really interesting you bring up how quickly that change in perception has happened. Have you felt that on the ground as well, just in your conversations with people from then to today?
Yeah, I have felt it. I think surprisingly, when we started in 2011, I was not a cannabis user myself. I mean, I've done it in college and done it every now and then, rarely. Since then, it was illegal. It wasn't really my thing. And then, so when I did this, a lot of people that I knew were kind of surprised, and they're like, "Wait, what? You're starting a marijuana, like a weed publication? Where you're like closet, High Times reader and." And it wasn't the case. And these were professional journalists. These were my friends from college. These were people that just wondered what the heck I was doing. But I didn't really encounter much resistance when I would talk to people. If anything, people were intrigued back then. Even if they didn't necessarily agree with it, they weren't anti it. They said, that's weird. And they just wouldn't really ask any more questions. No one really came out and said, oh my God, this is the devil's lettuce. What are you doing? You're supporting, you're going to support this illegal drug. But what I've seen, to your question along the way, is more people are fascinated by it because they see it helping their communities. It's helping them. It's helping people in their family, right? I can't tell you, almost everyone I meet nowadays has some personal experience with cannabis from someone they know. It might be their grandparents, might be themselves, as I said, it might be a friend or someone they heard about or a colleague that is using it beneficially on the medical side. And then others just feel that the recreational side isn't the sky is falling situation everyone said it would be. So, very little resistance I heard back then, even less now. And more than anything, people now are kind of like, well, how do I get into the industry? That seems to be their question. They didn't really ask that before, but now I hear that all the time.
And I think it's a great point you bring up too with the stigma. And I certainly even still felt that leaving traditional private equity to get into cannabis back in 2018. And I think that stigma is a real thing. And it was certainly, I'm sure, a roadblock for a lot of entrepreneurs who saw the opportunity and probably would have jumped in otherwise. but they just didn't feel like they wanted to be affiliated with, a quote unquote vice industry. And we certainly have seen that even in the last several years. That pace has continued to accelerate just in the terms of the quality of management teams we're seeing and the deals we're looking at and all of that. So really excited to see the progress continue and to normalize.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, the people who did this in the first, especially 5, 6, 7 years, were taking on a lot of risk. You didn't know if the federal government was going to come in and raid your operation. It did happen. There were raids in California, in Montana, in Washington State, in Colorado, in 2011, 2012, and that risk was there for a long time. There was a risk of the audits and maybe your whole financial situation crumbling. And then, of course, there was the risk to your personal and professional reputations. If for many years, if you were in the cannabis industry, you didn't want to tell the other kids' parents, at the soccer game on Saturday, what you did for a living, right? Because they might say, "Get away from my kid." And so there was a lot of that stigma, or your professional life. If I go into cannabis and it doesn't work out, and I want to get back into what I was doing before, now is that going to hurt me? Because people are going to look at my resume and experience and say, "What? You're working for a marijuana company? No way you're going to work over here." So a lot of that has evaporated, and it's becoming, the cool business opportunity.
Yeah. So diving further into MJ Business Daily, know you guys have a lot of different business lines at that point. So maybe just from an operational perspective, would love to hear the history of how you built the company.
Yeah, it was really from day one about trying to serve an emerging industry with credible, reliable information, and that's really what has underpinned everything we've done since then. And at first, it really was information. I was writing little reports on how to land financing, or the regulatory checklists in Colorado that I was compiling. It was news and analysis written by a journalist like myself, a business journalist that was focused purely on the business side, not the consumer, not the patient, not the advocates. And not that they're not important, they totally are, but we had a very narrow laser-like focus that no one was doing, because it's easy to get distracted in this industry. And no one was bringing that professional business approach to any type of information or content. So that's really how it started. It was how best can we serve the entrepreneurs, the investors, the executives in this industry who are trying to feel their way along and have very little places to turn to for information and data. And then that evolved quickly into, okay, we see a hole with in getting people together in a professional venue to network, to learn from each other, to educate others, and then to market and sell their products or find new ones. And that was the traditional trade show model, which is out there in every single industry. But this industry didn't have one that was run like we did it. At the time, the shows were very you'd have a medical cannabis show, it had nothing to do with anything medical. And it was what you'd expect. It was bongs on the show floor, and it was, some 80s rap band singing, smoking on stage. And it wasn't for business people, or at least the type of business people fueling the industry. And so that's what we brought to the industry. And I remember the first one, I wore a suit and tie, right? And we went out on a limb. I didn't want to be seen as the outsider, but on the other hand, it was like, hey, if you want the industry, if you want the mainstream to take you seriously, act serious and get serious about growing your business. And yes, helping patients. At that time, it was only medical, but thinking about it from a different lens. How do you stay in touch with changing patient wants and needs? That's a fundamental business concept, but it's also something that's helps people and that you should be paying attention to. How do you grow your business? How do you tackle 280E? And what are strategies to get around that? None of that was being talked about. So, we evolved from kind of a media approach, and then we had data, our marijuana business fact book, which we still do today, intensive research project every year for the industry. And then we evolved into events. What's that?
Then I've got a copy here.
All right. Yeah, we have our next one coming out very soon here. But, it was all that. It was the types of things that could help people in the industry.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And so with regards to the newsletter and the various periodicals, how have you seen your viewership or readership rather change over time?
Yeah, I think at first there was nowhere to go at all for this type of information I've been talking about, this type of content, this type of networking, these type of business venues and events. And so I think we helped professionalize the industry, and I don't say that with like with any hubris, but that was part of our goal. And what we've seen along the way is now there's a lot of places to get information. There's a lot of places to get data. It was a black hole of data. Our first fact book, I would be up until 3 or 4 a.m. Working from home because we didn't have an office for the first couple of years, and putting together this massive research report. And I was looking at every state that had legalized and saying, okay, how many licenses do they have, business licenses, and what are the medical conditions, and how many patients, and how has that changed, and what is the potential revenue, what are sales? And it was so difficult because states weren't even tracking this information, or they were tracking it differently. Some states didn't track it at all. They didn't even know how many retailers, dispensaries were in their state. Like it was insane. And you'd be digging through all these documents and seeing whatever you could piece together. And I had to come up with, projections and estimates and methodologies behind it. And that's because there was nothing out there. Now, there's a ton of data. There's companies, offering POS systems that are getting real-time, solid data on sales, product tracing, and all of that. So, and then there's other companies that just do data. So that's really evolved. So people now have a lot of places to go for information and for help. There's a ton of events out there now too. So as anyone running a business knows, you have got to be flexible along the way, and you've got to make sure that you are constantly in touch with whoever you're trying to serve. For us, it's a reader, it's a conference attendee, it's an advertiser, it's an exhibitor. And in some cases, we fell behind some of the trends because you get fat and happy, and you're doing what you did the whole time that made you successful, and you just keep doing that. And in other cases, we did innovate and we did expand. So we have a big focus the last couple of years on making sure we're having those connections with the industry to make sure we're doing and serving them in the right way. And so now readers are more discerning, and they want very specific information a lot of times. And before, it was any information you get was cool, right, and great. Now, you know what, if you're a cultivator or you're running a cultivation operation, you need data or information specific to that niche. And that's harder and harder to do because you have to drill down. You have your own issues. They're different from what a retailer experiences or an ancillary company or whatever. So it's become so broad and big. Our challenge is, where do you stay surface level to give the bigger picture, and where do you drill down deeper for more insightful information, how-tos, takeaways from others who have done it, and data, and because you can't do it all. So that's how we've seen the readership in particular change, is they want more information deeper into their specific areas.
Got it. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and one last thing I'd say is the mainstream media, which I came from, really saw this industry as more of a joke for many years after we started. And they gave us nicknames like the Wall Street of weed. They were always trying to put puns into things and headlines, and they had no full-time staffers, reporters covering this industry. It was just a side thing.
Yeah.
And I could not believe it when you would look at a major state like California, and the Los Angeles Times didn't have a cannabis business reporter with everything going on. I mean, it was a massive industry in the shadows. It was unregulated. It was going, trying to get regulations, and it was just a side thing. No one's taking the industry seriously. So now there's more mainstream media actually devoting a lot of good quality attention to the industry. And so I think that's benefited readers in general.
Totally. And back to that whole stigma thing, right? I think you're certainly not the first executive from a cannabis business who's had to face that dismissive attitude or whatever it may be. But, and I think this gets into our next topic of discussion. You're going to be, and others in the industry have clearly proven that they're laughing all the way to the bank. And I think that gets us right into the recent announcement you guys had of a huge acquisition by EmeraldX. So we'd love to learn more about your exit of the business.
Yeah, I mean, talk to anyone in the industry. If you're in it, you'll know. I have a podcast, Seed to CEO. I talk to other CEOs and executives, and we all say the same thing. This is going to be the hardest industry you've ever worked in, because it changes so quickly, and there are so many opportunities, there are so many distractions, there are people in it, can be fabulous, they can be weird, they can be tough to deal with from a business perspective. So many challenges along the way. So, we've been doing this for 11 years now. That's like 40 years in any other industry. And so, we built this, we learned a lot of lessons. I think we did a lot of things right as well, but, then we hit COVID, right? And in our business model, which leaned heavily on live events, it started more on the media side, but then the events took off and that became the vast majority of our revenue. That disappeared overnight. And yes, we were hit as hard as hotels, airlines, anyone in those types of industries, restaurants, even harder because we couldn't come back for a long time. And so, we had a very difficult 2020 into 2021. And, we were never on the verge of not making it, but we had to make painful decisions, downsize, reorganize, rethink what we were doing. So then we came out of it, right? And we were able to host last October, MJ BizCon, our big flagship event in Las Vegas. And we had a very successful event with more than 27,000 business attendees and, more than 1,200 exhibitors. And along that way, towards the second half of 2021, Anne and Cassandra, who are the two owners, had basically said, we're ready to pass the torch to another ownership group because we've done what we can over 10, 11 years, and it's time. We need to level up our skill set too. And because to compete going forward is going to take different skills than it did to get to this point. And I've been saying that for the last year or two. I've seen it all over the place. So, we laid down the groundwork, and we're able to complete a transaction with EmeraldX, which is a publicly traded mainstream business event company. So what's interesting about this is there's been a lot of M&A activity in the industry, as you well know. The vast majority of it is between cannabis companies, or a cannabis fund taking a large equity majority stake in a cannabis company, or one retailer gobbling up another. We are one of the few examples so far of a fully mainstream company with no interest in cannabis to date, acquiring, that they acquired us as their first foray into cannabis, again, publicly traded as well. And so I do think it means a lot for the industry because we've been seeing this momentum build, right, for everything we've been talking about. People taking it seriously, people seeing the opportunity, it becoming mainstream, the general public accepting it, the stigma eroding. And this is a great indication of that. And I expect fully to see more of the mainstream companies come in when they feel comfortable with the situation. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we couldn't have sold to a company like this because of the stigma was still strong, because the legal team with the company would say, we're not going to take on this risk. But you've seen the cracks appear in that, right? And that more companies are taking that risk. You've seen mainstream beverage companies, get involved and launching CBD brands, and in some cases THC. And so you're starting to see this all over. And as more companies do it, the more cracks appear in that dam. And for us, it was, I'm still here doing what I was doing before. So I'm still fully immersed in it, but it was the culmination, at least, of the first very, very long chapter of MJ Biz, because now we turn the page, and there's a lot more work to be done. But it was a very good feeling, especially coming off a very, very difficult, year and a half period under COVID.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. That's really exciting.
Thank you. Yep.
And so as we look towards more mergers, I think I certainly agree with your assessment that we're going to see more non-cannabis players entering the cannabis market for the first time. And I also expect we'll see additional consolidation amongst the big cannabis existing MSOs, right? And
no doubt.
The last few weeks, you saw Livewell and PharmaCann coming together. You're now seeing the announcement of Cresco and Columbia Care. And so would love to get your views on how you expect the landscape for consolidation to continue progressing here in the future.
Yeah, and so at MJ BizCon in October, I've been doing this thing for many years where I'll give predictions at the end of my kind of state of the industry speech to kick off the event. And so I track my record with the last year's predictions and then offer new ones. And oftentimes I'm wrong, and other times I'm right. It's a fool's errand, but it's just kind of a fun thing. And so at that show in October, that was exactly one of my predictions, was that this year we were going to see 2 to 3 large deals in the US between major players. And we saw that first happen last year with Trulieve and Harvest, announcing that deal. But we had started to see that in Canada too. So it felt to me like this was the year where that's really going to take hold in the US, because the market's ripe for that. You finally have these bigger MSOs that have been, in some cases strategically, in some cases not so strategically, expanding across the country, and they were going to start teaming up and merging, and so that's what's starting. We're starting to see that already in early April here. It's a natural progression in any industry, and I think now you have the capital behind a lot of these companies to be able to pull off these moves. These are massive deals for the cannabis industry. In other industries like tech, these are still tiny, but these are big deals. This is another iteration of the cannabis industry, and you're seeing that you not only have the capital, you have the expertise. A lot of these MSOs have hired people on who have done this before in other industries, right? They are finance, merger, acquisition, growth, scaling experts, and a lot of them are leading the charge to do this. And so I expect that to continue to play out. You have these people who see the potential of where this industry is going to go, and they know who the winners and losers are likely going to be. And they're trying to say, we're going to be the next Starbucks, McDonald's, you name it, of the cannabis industry. And this is what we need to do. Now, I would caution everyone out there, these things can backfire extraordinarily. We saw that. Saw Canadian cannabis companies mess a lot of this up with mergers, acquisitions, with growth and scaling, and making really bad investments based on hype and unrealistic growth projections and estimates. So it's not like all of these are destined to become, mega mergers that turn them into the next Starbucks or whatever you want to compare it to. The real work is beginning after they do these mergers.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's funny you talk about that, hype on the Canadian markets. And I think in a lot of ways, that time period where we saw all that excitement when, Constellation came into Canopy and public markets were going crazy, in a lot of ways, that's hurt the industry because a lot of investors were just burnt by these overinflated valuations and have been too hesitant to get back in.
Yeah, and the Canadian story is fascinating. A lot of lessons to be learned, and that's a big one that you hope that the U.S. companies now going through similar things have learned, and you're hoping this outside business expertise is enough to make sure they avoid that. But I mean, we see ridiculous moves in the business world every day among companies and people that should know better. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But yeah, I mean, we saw what happens if you're not careful with this in the not so distant past.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm curious to get your thoughts too, as these mega mergers continue. You talk about the regulatory process too. And in particular, as we think about this, like Cresco Columbia Care merger, I think it was a week or two ago, you guys published an article about how many assets are going to be divested. So how do you expect that complicated regulatory environment is going to impact the merger landscape in the future?
Yeah, I think these are the test cases that we're seeing, these first couple doing it here. It's an immensely complicated process. It's in other industries. There are some highly regulated industries that are similar for sure, but in many industries, you don't have the hurdles of every state that these companies operate in is completely different from a regulatory situation than other states. And so, and you don't have people in the US who have done it at this scale in this industry before. before basically last year, when that's still playing out with True Leave and Harvest. So they're kind of the guinea pigs, and it is an immensely difficult situation. The one thing is that these companies now should have their regulatory and compliance teams, really fully built up and ready to go to understand how this is all going to work. I don't think they would have gotten this big without, being at an A+ level in that area anyway, because it is so complex. But yeah, I don't know what issues are going to crop up. I mean, in some cases you have states that don't allow outside investment, or you can only own a certain number of licenses, and there's just a myriad issues you've got to work through. And then the biggest isn't necessarily the best. We've seen in Canada another example. Some of these large producers are getting their butts handed to them by the craft producers now, and they're actually losing market share, even though they've gobbled up their competitors. And so we have to see where this all goes. The key, as you well know, is going to be, how can they integrate all of this? How effectively can they do that, and then come up with a business plan around that in the long term, without losing their focus, without getting bogged down in all the stuff, or without losing touch, with the patient or consumer base. And by the way, those are different in every state too. So you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. In many cases, you can't have the Starbucks approach, because guess what? A patient or consumer in California is really different in terms of wants and needs than one in New York, and versus one in Oklahoma versus one in Florida. So you've got to be dialed into each of these markets, and you can't just have the same types of products on the shelves, not only because of regulations, but also because of preferences and the maturity of the market, the maturity and sophistication of the consumer and the patient.
Yeah, absolutely. And of the supply chain.
The supply chain, yep.
Yeah. So then, Chris, shifting to the regulatory front, I think a lot of excitement from folks, more even outside the industry, with regards to more getting reintroduced. And that's something that's kind of always been funny to me, is that a lot of the stuff that moves the public markets are things that are legislative at the federal level that we in the industry know really have no practical likelihood of getting passed. Then when companies report earnings, even if those fundamentals are really strong, the market doesn't move at all. So it's just kind of an interesting dislocation we tend to see. So I'm curious to get your thoughts with that potentially loaded question, what your views are on the MORE Act and the legislative framework going forward.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, that the markets don't move on anything that a normal industry moves on. When you expect that it's going to move up or down based on something, it doesn't do anything, and then when you expect it's not going to do anything, all of a sudden it's up or down, and you're like, what the hell? What is this moving on? I can't even figure it out half the time. But to your point, yes, anything tied to federal legislation, usually results in a rapid near-term swing just from the headlines alone. The House passing, a cannabis reform bill, is great, but we all know the chances of that clearing the Senate are minuscule, and the House already did it once, right? So I think people just read into it and maybe don't even know, and then just say, oh, cool, this is going to pass. And that fuels the retail investors, with $300 who are like, I'm buying cannabis stocks. I mean, I hear it all the time from people I know, friends or family, who see something like that, and they're like, oh, which stock should I invest in? And I'm like, hey, I'm not giving you advice. We don't play that role, with journalism ethics. But so yeah, to your point, the one thing that this move does, when the House or federal government chamber or committee does something, is it just moves that needle further. So what we've seen time and time again in the history of cannabis legalization and legislation is it's a bunch of small wins over time that eventually leads to the big one. It's not a switch anywhere. It's like there's usually resistance. It's a couple people, carrying the flag, legislators or advocates, and then they get enough for the ballot. Maybe it doesn't pass the first time, or a lawmaker, there's 2 or 3, and they get a couple signatures. It doesn't get out of committee, and then it builds, right? And then people learn more about it. They become more comfortable with it. They look at other parts of the country now that have done it, and they realize there aren't the negatives they saw. So something like this, the second time the House passing this is significant only in the sense that it will continue to build that momentum. And this is what has to happen before it actually passes. I mean, to think that the federal government would pass some sweeping legislation, on cannabis, in just a couple of years, like if we go back a couple of years, is silly when you really think about it. Now, I will tell you, in 2017, 18, I did think we were going to see federal change. I didn't know what it was going to look like, maybe banking or something, but that didn't happen. So I told you about my predictions that when I was wrong. So I'm hesitant to talk about the federal situation because it's so hard to figure out. We would have never guessed in 2011, when there were 12, 13 states that had legalized medical, and many of them without regulations, that in just 10 years, you'd have 39 states plus DC that had legalized medical, and 19 plus DC that had legalized recreational. So it has moved on a state basis very quickly over 10 years. You got to think the dam is going to break federally soon, but it always feels like it's about to break, and then it never does.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it could break with safe banking this year?
I was way more optimistic about that, earlier last year, until some key lawmakers were trying to get others to vote against it to pass a bigger sweeping bill. Because, the Cory Bookers of the world were saying, you know what, if we pass that, that's only a small win. When we really need to pass this big thing with social equity and letting states decide, it's like, totally hear you. Yes, that should be the ultimate goal, but you're not going to get there without incremental change. So that the fact that there was kind of a fracturing among the people who are really championing this and should be rallying together, and to think this is going to be an all or nothing move here at the federal level is silly. It could set us back a decade, because it's going to take forever to get any type of agreement on what that should look like, a majority agreement. So that's really discouraging for me. So I don't know. I don't know if banking, if we're going to see that this year. I mean, the window's closing. If the Democrats, if what happens in the next election happens, the Republicans could, and there are signs, some Republicans are trying to say, okay, we're going to be the ones that do it. And they are now starting to embrace some changes to cannabis laws federally. But who knows? This was largely seen as the big window, with the Democrats having the majority to do something, and the window's almost shut.
Yep. Well, maybe on a brighter note, how about any predictions for November at the state level?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a fantastic run for legalization in the last 2 years. You had a couple states legalize in 2020 before the election, and then you had a clean sweep with 5 states legalizing. Every state that had a measure on its ballot passed it, in most cases by a large margin. You had some resistance in Mississippi, but it has legalized now after a judge overturned it, and some problems in South Dakota. But what you saw is, red states really jumping on board the medical side now and shifting. That'll be the next wave, is some red states to go with adult use legalization. And then you turn the calendar to 2021, and oh damn, New York, adult use, that was a massive move, because New York's the financial capital of the world, and now you're getting people like yourself, who was in before that, who are taking it seriously. It's coming in their backyard now. So I think on the financial side, that's huge. And as that industry crops up there, the adult use side, you're going to get the attention of more hedge funds and venture capitalists and Wall Street in general. They're going to put pressure on federal government. All that money is going to put pressure on the federal government because of the opportunities. And then you had Connecticut, New Mexico, and Virginia, and it just keeps going. And so, there's a lot of states have legalized. There's a lot of markets that are up and running, but we still have a ways to go. And so, I'm fully expecting we're going to see another handful of states legalize. These are not the big New York size markets. Most of those are gone now. But any state that legalizes, I'm thinking 3 or 4 this year. I hate to pinpoint exactly which ones. There's always a dark horse or two. There's always one that looks promising that doesn't make it. But, I think we're going to move that legalization push forward, which only helps. It means more representatives in Congress are now representing people that have legalized cannabis and populations. And so, I think there'll be some promising red states that go this route. And that's what we need now. We need more of the red states to legalize medical and then rec. And then we have the big prizes going forward. Florida adult use legalization would be massive. Texas, a full medical program there would be good enough. And then, then you have to look forward to a day in the very distant future where this is more normalized and you're going to have, interstate commerce in cannabis. Now, that's a long way out, but still a lot of potential, a lot to look forward to, and a lot of challenging situations we're all going to find ourselves in.
And I'm sure through it all, a lot of news to report on.
Oh yeah. We're not worried about that for a long time.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining the podcast this afternoon. It's been such a blast.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
All right, you too.